Today we'll focus on the brain. My little drawing over here of the brain, I apologize, but I think we can kind of see the parts. I'm just going to list the main parts of the brain. We have the largest portion of the brain up here called the cerebrum. Now the cerebral cortex is an outer layer of that cerebrum. Okay, we have this region here, kind of the in-between portion, called the diencephalon. We have this region here, from the diencephalon to around here. This whole region is called the brain stem. And the brain stem, the stem of the brain, it's divided up into three parts: the mesencephalon, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. So again, this whole region is a brain stem composed of the three parts. Now the terms diencephalon, mesencephalon kind of refer to the developmental parts of the brain. So you might need to go back and take a look at how the brain develops, and these terms, some of the terms have stuck in the final anatomy of the brain. We have this portion here called the cerebellum. There. Now, cerebral spinal fluid, remember, is produced within spaces in the brain called ventricles. And there's different ventricles. We have the lateral ventricle located here. We have the third ventricle located here. Now, I said that's the diencephalon, but the diencephalon, if we take the two halves of the brains, because the cerebrum, there's a right and left brain, when we put it together, there's a little space between the diencephalon on the right side and the diencephalon on the left side. That space is called the third ventricle. Then there's a little canal here where the cerebral spinal fluid will pass through, called the mesencephalic duct, or the cerebral aqueduct here, that brings the CSF to this region here. This little space here is called the fourth ventricle. And from here, the fourth ventricle, then the cerebral spinal fluid makes its way out, down around the spinal cord, through the center of the spinal cord, around the brain, and bathes the brain. Okay, so those are the basic parts of the brain. There's a lot of smaller portions that you're responsible for. In the diencephalon, we have the thalamus, the hypothalamus down here. We have the pituitary gland hanging down there. The lobes of the cerebrum you need to know, as well as some other small structures within the diencephalon, mammillary bodies, and etc. So you'll have to review that. Let's take a look at some other support parts of the brain, the meninges. The meninges are the coverings of the brain, and there are three of them. The deep pia mater. The pia mater is a very thin layer that adheres right on the surface of the brain. In fact, the sulci, or the grooves in the brain, the pia mater extend down into those grooves also. Next, we have the arachnoid mater, which is a thin spider webby looking layer, and this does not extend down into the grooves. All right, so it lies on the top of the cerebrum, but overlying the pia mater. And on the outside, we have the dura mater here, which is a thick leathery layer for protection. There. Now the cerebral spinal fluid will circulate in what's called the subarachnoid space, which is a space deep to the arachnoid and between the arachnoid and the pia mater. There is a space there filled with CSF when we're living. All right, So that brings us to the cerebral spinal fluid, the CSF, produced by what's called the choroid plexus. The choroid plexus is a combination of capillaries and ependymal cells, and found within the ventricles of the brain. So within these spaces in the brain, it produces, by means of the choroid plexus, the CSF, which then circulates through and within these spaces and then surrounds the brain and the spinal cord. I put here arachnoid villi and granulations. Now, in certain areas, especially up here, right along the kind of superior portion of this, the arachnoid, this black layer, forms these little structures that pop up through the dura and into the blood, the veins that are found around the cerebrum. And these little parts of arachnoid that pop up through and into the blood, come and is surrounded by blood, is called the arachnoid villi. So there's a lot of little villi located along here where the arachnoid pops up, again through the dura and into the veins. And that's how the CSF, the cerebral spinal fluid, will make its way back into the bloodstream, because it's continuously produced, and if it's blocked at any pathways here, it's going to build up. And there's a condition called hydrocephalus, where that fluid, the CSF, builds up and it causes these ventricles to get very large and the head to become enormous. So in children, they're with these very large heads, they call water in the brain. It's actually CSF building up. So that's why we have to have a means of dumping that CSF back into the blood, and that's through these arachnoid villi. Now a whole bunch of these villi together form what's called granulations, arachnoid granulations, because it appears very grainy along the top here. The last thing I want to mention is the blood-brain barrier. And the blood-brain barrier is a very important part of the brain and support for the brain. It's made up of continuous capillaries. So within the brain, there's capillaries that that have what's called tight junctions that are held closely together. And surrounding those capillaries are astrocytes, or the feet of the astrocytes that wrap around and provide that extra protection for the brain, so substances that are traveling within the brain, within the capillaries, can't easily cross into the brain. It's a way to protect the brain from toxins and other things. Some fat-soluble molecules or lipid-soluble substances can actually pass across that easily, such as alcohol, some anesthetics, and nicotine are all substances that can easily pass across the blood-brain barrier. So think about the next time that you drink that alcohol, that it's easily crossing your blood-brain barrier and entering your brain. All right, thank you.